September the 25th, 1986. A small hill northeast of Jalalabad Airport, Afghanistan. Engineer Ghaffar pressed his body against the rocky ground, his heart pounding as he peered through the bushes at the distant runway. In his hands, he held a weapon that had never been fired in combat on Afghan soil. A 5-foot-long, 35-pound tube that American instructors had promised would change everything. The Americans must be desperate, he thought to himself. No superpower hands over its most advanced technology to mountain fighters unless the situation has become unbearable. Through the afternoon haze, he watched the silhouettes of 3 Mi-24 Hind helicopters descending toward the airfield. These were the machines the Mujahideen called Shaitan Arba, Satan's chariot. For 7 years, they had ruled Afghan skies with impunity, raining death upon villages, caravans, and resistance fighters who possessed nothing capable of reaching them. Today, Ghaffar and his small team of 35 fighters were about to discover whether the Americans had told them the truth. What none of them knew was that this moment would trigger the most dramatic reversal of air superiority in Cold War history. A single weapon system would transform the entire nature of the Soviet-Afghan conflict, turning the hunters into the hunted and demonstrating to the world that even superpowers could be brought to their knees by determined fighters armed with the right technology. The mathematics of Soviet defeat were being written not in Moscow or Washington, but on a dusty hillside where a former military engineer was about to pull a trigger that would echo across history. The roots of this transformation stretched back to Christmas Day, 1979. On December 25th, Soviet Defense Minister Dmitry Ustinov issued an official order stating that the state frontier of the Democratic Republic of Afghanistan was to be crossed on the ground and in the air by forces of the 40th Army at 1500 hours. Within days, approximately 30,000 Soviet troops poured across the border, beginning what the Kremlin believed would be a swift intervention to stabilize a faltering communist government. The Soviets had not anticipated fighting a war. They expected to secure major cities, install their preferred leader, Babrak Karmal, after eliminating the unpredictable Hafizullah Amin, and withdraw within a year. The 40th Army, under the command of Marshal Sergei Sokolov, consisted of 3 motorized rifle divisions, an airborne division, an assault brigade, and supporting units. Around 80,000 men with 1,800 tanks and 2,000 armored fighting vehicles. The firepower was overwhelming. The Afghan resistance, such as it existed, possessed little more than antiquated rifles and the determination of men defending their homeland. But the Soviets had fundamentally misunderstood the nature of Afghan resistance. The Mujahideen were not a conventional army that could be defeated in set-piece battles. They were farmers, shopkeepers, and tribesmen who melted into the population by day and emerged to fight by night. They knew every mountain pass, every hidden valley, every cave system that had sheltered Afghan warriors for centuries. Within months of the invasion, the rebellion had spread to 24 of the country's 28 provinces. The Soviet response was to double down on their technological advantage, and the centerpiece of that advantage was the Mi-24 Hind helicopter. The Mi-24 was unlike anything the Mujahideen had ever faced. Developed by the Mil Moscow helicopter plant and first flown in 1969, it represented a revolutionary concept in military aviation. The Hind combined the roles of attack helicopter and troop transport, capable of carrying 8 fully equipped soldiers while simultaneously unleashing a devastating firepower. Its armament was formidable. A 12.7mm Yak-B Gatling gun in the nose turret, unguided rocket pods carrying up to 192 rockets, anti-tank guided missiles, and the ability to drop bombs. The pilots sat in a titanium bathtub cockpit designed to withstand direct hits from 37mm anti-aircraft shells. The windows were bulletproof against 50 caliber rounds. Soviet pilots called it the flying tank. At the time of the invasion, more than 1,000 Mi-24s were in Soviet service. By 1980, an estimated 85 of these machines were deployed to Afghanistan, a number that would grow to approximately 120 by 1985. They became the symbol of Soviet power in the Afghan theater, much as the Huey helicopter had symbolized American intervention in Vietnam. The psychological impact on the Mujahideen was profound. The Hinds would appear without warning, rising over mountain ridges or swooping down valleys, their distinctive silhouettes immediately recognizable. The roar of their engines announced death from above. During the Panjshir Valley offensives against Ahmad Shah Massoud, Hinds would pound insurgent compounds with rockets and anti-tank missiles while providing support and escorting convoys of friendly troops. They hunted Mujahideen caravans carrying weapons from Pakistan, destroying supply lines that took months to establish. They inserted Spetsnaz special forces teams behind rebel positions, cutting off escape routes. They flew hunter-killer missions in pairs or groups of 4 or 8, using tactics developed during the Great Patriotic War against Hitler. One favorite technique was the Wheel of Death, with gunships turning in a wide circle to ensure one was always attacking the target area. The Mujahideen learned to move mostly at night to avoid the gunships. In response, the Soviets trained their crews in night fighting, dropping parachute flares to illuminate potential targets. The Hinds seemed unstoppable. From 1980 to 1985, the Soviets launched 9 major offensives into the strategically vital Panjshir Valley alone. Each operation demonstrated the devastating effectiveness of helicopter-centric warfare. The pattern was consistent. First, waves of bombers, including Tu-16s, flying from bases inside the Soviet Union, would pound the valley with conventional bombs. Then the helicopters would move in. Mi-24 gunships would suppress ground fire, while Mi-8 transports landed troops on ridge lines and in blocking positions. Mechanized columns would push up the valley floor. The Mujahideen would scatter into side valleys and caves, waiting for the Soviets to leave. And they always did leave. The Soviets could occupy terrain, but not hold it. Yet the cost to the resistance was staggering. By destroying crops, livestock, and villages, the Soviets forced the mass migration of civilians from areas like the Panjshir. This scorched earth approach deprived commanders like Massoud of the resources needed to sustain full-time fighters. Massoud was forced to sign a ceasefire in January 1983 simply to rebuild his organization. Even the Lion of Panjshir had to bow to Soviet air power. The Mujahideen were not defenseless against aircraft. They possessed DSHK heavy machine guns, capable of engaging targets up to 2,000 meters. They had RPG-7 rocket-propelled grenades, effective against hovering or slow-moving helicopters. They had captured SA-7 Strela missiles, the Soviet equivalent of early American shoulder-fired anti-aircraft systems. But none of these weapons could reliably defeat the Hind. The DSHK required the helicopter to fly within range and remain relatively stationary. The machine's armor could often deflect the rounds. RPGs required extraordinary skill and luck to hit a moving aircraft. The SA-7 was outdated technology with a success rate of barely 3%. Soviet pilots learned to deploy flares that confused the SA-7's primitive heat-seeking guidance. They changed tactics after 1980, flying nap-of-the-earth patterns that made targeting difficult. They approached from unexpected directions. They used terrain to mask their approach until the final attack run. The statistics told the story of Soviet dominance. From 1979 through 1985, Soviet aircraft losses remained relatively low despite constant combat operations. Yes, helicopters were shot down. The harsh Afghan terrain, the altitude that degraded helicopter performance, the dust that clogged engines, mechanical failures, and the occasional lucky shot all took their toll. But the Mujahideen could not change the fundamental equation. Soviet aircraft could operate where they wanted, when they wanted. The resistance could harass, but not prevent. In Washington and Islamabad, this reality weighed heavily on those supporting the Afghan resistance. The war had settled into a stalemate, with Soviet forces controlling the cities and major roads, while the Mujahideen held most of the countryside. But without the ability to challenge Soviet air power, that stalemate could continue indefinitely. The Soviets could resupply their garrisons by helicopter. They could insert troops to break Mujahideen sieges. They could punish any village suspected of supporting the resistance. The Mujahideen could win battles, but not the war. The decision to provide Stinger missiles to the Afghan resistance did not come easily. The FIM-92s. Stinger was among the most advanced and closely guarded weapons in the American arsenal. A man-portable air defense system that used an infrared homing guidance system that was far more sophisticated than anything previously deployed. Unlike the SA-7, which could only engage aircraft from behind by tracking engine exhaust, the Stinger could acquire targets from any angle. Its guidance system was designed to distinguish between flares and actual aircraft heat signatures. It could hit targets at altitudes up to 12,500 feet and ranges exceeding 3 miles. The missile weighed only 34.5 pounds, light enough for a single fighter to carry through mountain terrain. It could be ready to fire in seconds. The technology represented years of research and development, billions of dollars of investment, and capabilities that adversaries would desperately want to understand and counter. The Joint Chiefs of Staff initially resisted sending Stingers to Afghanistan. Their concern was not military effectiveness, but security. What if the missiles fell into the wrong hands? What if they were sold to Middle Eastern terrorists who might use them against civilian aircraft? What if the Soviets captured one and reverse-engineered the technology? These were not hypothetical fears. The Mujahideen factions were notoriously fractious, some with ideological positions that made American officials deeply uncomfortable. The CIA had been operating under the pretense that the United States was not directly involved in the war. All weapons supplied up to that point were non-American, including Kalashnikov assault rifles manufactured in China and Egypt, providing clearly American stingers would end any pretense of deniability. But by 1985, circumstances had changed. The Reagan administration had announced its intention to support anti-Soviet resistance movements globally, a policy that became known as the Reagan Doctrine. There was no longer a need to obfuscate the origin of weapons. Senior Pentagon official Michael Pillsbury successfully advocated for providing American-made weaponry to the Afghan resistance. Texas Congressman Charlie Wilson, whose seat on the House Defense Appropriations Subcommittee gave him access to the CIA's covert budget, had become a passionate champion of the Mujahideen cause after visiting refugee camps near Peshawar. Wilson pushed relentlessly for increased and more effective aid. His alliance with CIA officer Gust Avrakotos, who headed the Afghanistan Task Force, became one of the most consequential partnerships in intelligence history. By 1987, American aid to the Mujahideen had grown from the initial allocation of a few $100,000 in 1979 to $630 million annually, matched dollar for dollar by Saudi Arabia. It was described as the biggest bequest to any Third World insurgency in history. The final approval for Stinger deployment came from Pakistani President Mohammad Zia-ul-Haq, through whom all American aid had to flow. Zia had to balance his support for the Mujahideen against the risk of provoking direct Soviet retaliation against Pakistan. Soviet and Afghan aircraft had already conducted over 600 border violations between 1979 and 1985, sometimes attacking refugee camps inside Pakistani territory. Zia constantly gauged how much he could make the pot boil without inviting a Soviet invasion of his own country. In 1985, he finally agreed that the situation warranted the risk. The first Stinger missiles arrived in Pakistan in the spring of 1986. Training was conducted at the Inter-Services Intelligence Facility at Ojri Camp near Rawalpindi. Pakistani officers who had been trained in the United States returned to instruct selected Mujahideen fighters. The training was primitive but effective. Behind a white sheet, hung in a classroom, an instructor would slowly move a penlight that trainees would track with their training units, learning to acquire and follow heat sources. They practiced with dummy stingers aimed at hanging lights. The course lasted approximately 1 month. Only those who demonstrated competence received actual missiles. The first class graduated with 36 launchers and 154 missiles. The CIA was intensely interested in documenting the results. They outfitted the first Stinger teams with video cameras to record their engagements. This was not merely intelligence gathering. It was a recognition that they were about to test a thesis that could change the course of the war. The teams were divided. One group headed toward Kabul to target transport aircraft. The other, led by engineer Ghaffar, headed to Jalalabad to hunt the weapon that had terrorized Afghanistan for 7 years, the Hind. The journey to Jalalabad took 2 days on foot, moving through territory controlled by neither side, avoiding Soviet patrols and Afghan army checkpoints. Ghafar's team carried their precious cargo carefully wrapped against damage. Each Stinger launcher weighed approximately 35 pounds, the missiles themselves about the same. The men understood that they were carrying weapons worth more than entire villages in their war-torn country. The pressure was immense. If the first engagement failed, if the missiles proved ineffective, the entire program might be abandoned. Everything depended on what happened in the next few hours. On September 25, 1986, Ghaffar positioned his 35 fighters on a small hill approximately 1.5 kilometers northeast of Jalalabad Airport runway. He organized them into 3 firing teams arranged in a triangle, each within shouting distance of the others. Each team had 3 shooters and 2 assistants holding additional missiles for quick reloading. No one knew from which direction aircraft might appear, so the triangular formation provided coverage in all directions. They waited in the bushes and rocks, scanning the skies. The afternoon dragged on. Then, through the haze, they spotted their targets. 3 Mi-24 Hind helicopter gunships returning from a patrol, descending toward the airfield for landing. The Stinger's targeting system came alive. Each shooter selected a helicopter through the open sight. The friend or foe identification system signaled with an intermittent tone that enemy targets were in range. The guidance head captured the thermal radiation from the helicopter engines. The moment the lead helicopter dropped to approximately 200 meters above the ground, Ghaffar gave the command, fire. The first missile, launched by Ghaffar himself, traveled the prescribed 6 meters on its launch charge, and then the rocket motor failed to ignite. The missile fell to the ground, clattering among the rocks until its momentum was spent. But the other shooters were already firing. Abdul Wahab, who had memorized the pre-launch prayer and whispered it before pulling the trigger, watched his Stinger streak toward its target. The missile found the Hind's heat signature and slammed into the helicopter. He would later describe watching the tail rotor break away while the front section burst into flames and plummeted to earth, cockpit first. "I will never forget that moment," he said years later. "Those helicopters had killed so many people, left so many orphans." Ghaffar shouldered a spare Stinger and fired again. This time the missile worked. A second Hind went down in flames. The CIA later reported that 3 helicopters had been destroyed, though Mujahideen accounts varied on the exact number. What was not in dispute was the result. In a matter of seconds, weapons that had dominated Afghan skies for 7 years were falling from them. The Soviet response was immediate. Soviet air operations stood down across eastern Afghanistan for the following week. When they resumed, aircraft were flying at dramatically higher altitudes. The new rule of thumb became 20,000 feet, approximately twice the Stinger's effective ceiling. But flying at 20,000 feet fundamentally changed what aircraft could accomplish. Helicopters and ground attack jets could no longer provide the close air support that had been so devastating to Mujahideen positions. Accuracy plummeted when bombs and rockets were released from such heights. The intimate connection between air and ground, forces that had characterized Soviet operations, was severed. In the first month of Stinger employment, Mujahideen teams shot down 3 Mi-24s. By the end of 1986, the Soviets had lost 23 aircraft to ground fire. One Soviet squadron lost 13 of its 40 planes in the year following the Stinger's introduction, 10 of them to the American missiles. The psychological transformation matched the tactical one. Mujahideen morale soared. For the first time, they possessed the means to strike back at their most feared enemy. Charlie Wilson later described the first Stinger shootdowns as one of the 3 crucial moments of his experience in the war, saying, "We never really won a set-piece battle before September 26, and then we never lost one afterwards." He was given the first spent Stinger tube as a gift and kept it on his office wall. That launch tube is now on exhibit at the U.S. Army Air Defense Artillery Museum at Fort Sill, Oklahoma. The statistics from this period tell a story of transformation. According to the 1993 U.S. Air Defense Artillery Yearbook, Mujahideen gunners used Stingers to score approximately 269 aircraft kills in about 340 engagements. That represented a 79% hit rate, an extraordinarily high figure by any standard. Soviet sources placed their total losses lower at 113 fixed-wing aircraft and 333 helicopters during the entire war. American estimates from 1988 suggested around 1,400 aircraft lost, including those destroyed in airfield attacks. The true number likely fell somewhere in between. What was undeniable was that the Stinger had fundamentally altered the equation. Before the Stinger, the Mujahideen had shot down aircraft at a rate of approximately 3% using SA-7 missiles. After the Stinger, the rate jumped to 20% or higher. The Soviets desperately sought countermeasures. They retrofitted aircraft with flare dispensers designed to decoy infrared-guided missiles. They added infrared jammers to helicopter systems. They installed exhaust baffles to reduce heat signatures. They experimented with beacon systems meant to confuse missile guidance. Soviet engineers worked around the clock once they finally obtained captured Stinger components, trying to understand and defeat the technology. But the Stinger's sophisticated seeker was designed to distinguish between countermeasures and actual targets. Soviet pilots found their flares less effective than expected. Night operations became the preferred approach, as the Stinger was more difficult to employ in darkness. Terrain-hugging flight at extreme low altitude offered some protection, keeping helicopters below the minimum engagement envelope. But flying at treetop level brought its own dangers. Pilots risked collision with terrain, and low altitude made them vulnerable to the machine guns and RPGs that had always threatened them. The changes forced upon Soviet air doctrine were sweeping. Before the Stinger, helicopters had operated with relative impunity at medium altitudes, high enough to avoid most ground fire, but low enough for accurate weapons delivery. Now they had to choose between vulnerability to missiles and vulnerability to conventional weapons. Some units attempted to maintain high-altitude approaches, diving to attack altitude only at the last moment before releasing weapons and immediately climbing back to safety. Others switched almost entirely to night operations, accepting the reduced effectiveness that came with darkness. Still others were simply withdrawn from the most dangerous sectors, leaving ground forces without the air support they had come to depend upon. The tactical adaptations came at tremendous operational cost. Helicopters that once operated freely in daylight now had to fly at night or hug dangerous terrain. Ground attack jets that once swooped low to deliver accurate strikes now released ordnance from heights that made precision impossible. Air support that once saved Soviet and Afghan army units in desperate situations became unreliable or unavailable. The ripple effects extended throughout the war effort. Transport helicopters that resupplied isolated garrisons became targets. Convoys that once relied on air cover found themselves more vulnerable to ambush. The initiative that Soviet air power had provided shifted inexorably toward the resistance. The Soviets launched a frantic hunt for intact Stinger missiles. Understanding the technology was essential to developing effective countermeasures. Special Forces units received orders to capture the weapons at any cost. In January 1987, a reconnaissance unit commanded by Senior Lieutenant Vladimir Kovtun spotted a group of armed men on 3 motorcycles. When the Mujahideen saw the helicopters, they stopped and opened fire, launching 2 missiles. The pilots maneuvered evasively while Mi-24s provided covering fire. Kovtun and 4 soldiers won the ensuing ground engagement and recovered a Stinger along with its technical documentation. Soviet engineers finally had their chance to study the weapon that was destroying their air force. But by then, the damage was done. The spring of 1987 brought an expanded Stinger presence throughout Afghanistan. The CIA had delivered approximately 300 missiles in 1986, followed by 700 more in 1987. By some estimates, between 2,000 and 2,500, Stingers were ultimately shipped to the Mujahideen over the course of the war. The ISI training school at Ojri camp continued producing Stinger-qualified fighters. Selected Mujahideen received approximately 2 weeks of instruction before being deemed combat-ready. The weapons spread to factions across the country, near Jaji in southern Afghanistan in June 1980. 7. A Soviet offensive attempting to seal the border with Pakistan collapsed after the Mujahideen shot down 6 aircraft, including a transport helicopter. Soviet tanks, unable to operate in the mountainous terrain without air cover, were forced to remain in vulnerable lowland positions. Air reconnaissance missions were thwarted throughout the offensive by the presence of Stingers, which ruled out helicopter use and forced jets to fly too high and fast to gain accurate intelligence on Mujahideen positions. The Soviets were forced to rely on blind blanket shelling, hoping that saturation artillery fire would compensate for their inability to precisely locate enemy positions. It did not. The offensive failed, and the border remained open to Mujahideen supply routes. The experience at Jaji was repeated across Afghanistan. Government garrisons that had relied on helicopter resupply found themselves isolated. Convoys that had depended on air cover faced ambushes without the ability to call in effective support. Soviet and Afghan army units that had counted on air evacuation of wounded watched casualties mount as helicopters could no longer safely approach landing zones in contested areas. The entire system that had sustained Soviet operations began to break down. The broader strategic implications began to crystallize. Before the Stinger, Soviet air operations had been a constant. After the Stinger, every flight became a calculated risk. A special army report commissioned by Army Chief of Staff General Karl Vuono in 1989 examined the Stinger's impact over the war's final 3 years. The conclusion was unambiguous. The Stinger changed the nature of combat and was the war's decisive weapon. Before the Stinger, Soviet fixed and rotary wing aircraft always won the day. In September 1986, the war style changed dramatically. Air combat skirmishes became ineffective. The previously uninterrupted movement and supply of troops was no longer normal. Soviet-Afghan offensive air operations stopped for a month after the first shootdowns. When they resumed, it was under a new reality. The control of the skies, the report noted, was as vital in a guerrilla low-intensity conflict as in conventional warfare. After the Stinger was introduced, the guerrillas were able to transport and use more effectively other weapons, such as mortars, anti-tank rockets, and recoilless rifles. Freedom to move meant freedom to mass forces, to attack government outposts, to resupply forward positions, to coordinate operations across wide areas. The Stinger had not merely destroyed aircraft, it had fundamentally altered the nature of the conflict. By November 1986, Mikhail Gorbachev had made a decision that would have seemed unthinkable when Soviet troops first crossed the border. Afghanistan had become a bleeding wound, in his now famous phrase. The Soviet Union would withdraw. Gorbachev had actually begun planning for disengagement soon after becoming General Secretary in March 1985, before the Stingers arrived. Internal assessments had already recognized the impossibility of decisive military victory. The war was draining resources desperately needed for economic reform. International condemnation isolated Moscow diplomatically, but the Stinger accelerated the timeline and removed any illusion that additional military effort might change the outcome. Throughout 1985, the Soviets had attempted to force a military solution. That year became the bloodiest of the war. with combat operations reaching their peak intensity. Soviet troop strength climbed to approximately 108,000. But the Mujahideen did not break. They could not hold territory against Soviet offensives, but they could not be destroyed either. By the time Gorbachev summoned Afghan leader Mohammad Najibullah to Moscow in late 1986, the decision was made. The Afghans had 2 years to prepare for Soviet withdrawal and to implement a policy of national reconciliation backed by massive economic and military aid. On February 8, 1988, the Soviet leadership announced a conditional date for beginning the military withdrawal. The Geneva Accords were signed on April 14, 1988, between Afghanistan and Pakistan, with the United States and Soviet Union serving as guarantors. The agreement established a timetable for complete Soviet withdrawal by February 15, 1989. The Mujahideen, notably, were not party to the accords and refused to accept their terms. They intended to continue fighting until the communist government in Kabul was destroyed. The withdrawal proceeded in 2 phases. The first began on May 15, 1988, with Soviet forces pulling out from the western and eastern provinces. By August, approximately half the troops had departed. The second phase began in January 1989 and continued through the deadline. The final months were not without drama. Soviet aircraft flew over 1,000 sorties against Mujahideen positions in Operation Typhoon, targeting the forces of Ahmad Shah Massoud in the Panjshir Valley. This last offensive killed approximately 600 of Massoud's fighters, but it could not change the fundamental reality. The Soviets were leaving. On February 15, 1989, Lieutenant General Boris Gromov, commander of the 40th Army, walked across the Friendship Bridge into Uzbekistan. He was the last Soviet soldier to leave Afghanistan. The moment was laden with symbolism. Gromov walked alone, leaving his vehicle behind, crossing the bridge on foot as cameras recorded the scene for posterity. Soviet media captured the homecoming of their soldiers, the bands playing, the crowds cheering, the official narrative of a mission completed rather than a defeat acknowledged. But everyone understood what had really happened. A superpower had been fought to a standstill by guerrillas armed with faith, determination, and American missiles. Behind him, Soviet forces had transferred around 990 armored vehicles, approximately 3,000 trucks, 142 artillery pieces, 82 mortars, 43 multiple rocket launchers, 321 air defense systems, over 14,000 small arms, and around 1,700 rocket launchers to the Afghan military they were leaving behind. It was a massive arsenal intended to allow the Najibullah government to survive without Soviet troops. It would prove insufficient. The cost of the war was staggering. Official Soviet figures recorded 14,453 killed, 53,753 wounded, and 417 missing over nearly 10 years of combat. Some estimates placed the total casualties higher when accounting for deaths from disease, accidents, and other causes. The Soviets had lost at least 333 helicopters and 118 fixed-wing aircraft. They left behind a country shattered by conflict. Afghan casualties were far greater. Estimates range from 1 million to 2 million dead, the vast majority civilians. Millions more had fled as refugees to Pakistan and Iran. The infrastructure of Afghan society, never robust, had been systematically destroyed. The debate over what caused the Soviet withdrawal has never been fully resolved. Some scholars argue that Gorbachev had already decided to leave before the stingers arrived, that the decision was fundamentally political rather than military. They point to archival evidence suggesting that by October 1985, Gorbachev had won Politburo support for a withdrawal plan. Soviet Foreign Minister Eduard Shevardnadze later lamented that the decision to leave Afghanistan was the first and most difficult step, and everything else flowed from that. This view implied that the decision preceded the Stinger's impact and would have happened regardless of tactical developments on the ground. Others point to the undeniable tactical impact of the missiles, the way they neutralized Soviet air superiority and shifted battlefield dynamics. They argue that whatever Gorbachev's intentions, the reality on the ground shaped the urgency and timeline of withdrawal. The truth likely encompasses both perspectives. The Stinger did not single-handedly win the war. The Mujahideen's determination, the terrain that favored guerrilla warfare, the support from Pakistan, the United States, Saudi Arabia, China, and other nations, the fundamental mismatch between Soviet conventional military doctrine and counterinsurgency requirements, all of these factors contributed to the outcome. But the Stinger was the weapon that made continued Soviet military operations untenable. It was the instrument that transformed a costly stalemate into an unsustainable bleeding wound. The legacy of the Stinger program extended far beyond the Soviet withdrawal. In the years that followed, the United States, launched a frantic effort to buy back the missiles it had distributed so freely. A $55 million program beginning in 1990 aimed to recover approximately 300 missiles at a cost of around $183,000 each. The buyback was only partially successful. By 1996, approximately 600 Stingers remained unaccounted for. Some found their way to Iran, others to Croatia, Sri Lanka, Qatar, and North Korea. Charlie Wilson later told CBS that he lived in terror that a civilian airliner would be shot down by a Stinger, though he never expressed regret about providing them to defeat the Soviets. The aftermath in Afghanistan itself was catastrophic. The Mujahideen factions that had united against the common Soviet enemy turned on each other. Civil war consumed the country. The communist government of Mohammad Najibullah held on until April 1992, sustained by continued Soviet and then Russian military aid. When that aid stopped following the dissolution of the Soviet Union in December 1991, his government collapsed within months. The chaos that followed created the conditions for the rise of the Taliban, who took Kabul in 1996 and imposed their harsh interpretation of Islamic law. Many of the weapons supplied during Operation Cyclone remained in circulation, fueling conflicts for decades to come. Yet the transformation that began on that hillside near Jalalabad Airport remains one of the most significant military developments of the Cold War era. It demonstrated that determined fighters armed with appropriate technology could challenge even superpowers. It validated the concept of asymmetric warfare in ways that would influence conflicts around the world. It contributed to the eventual collapse of the Soviet Union, an outcome that reshaped global politics. The Stinger itself became legendary. It entered popular culture through books like George Cryle's Charlie Wilson's War and the film adaptation starring Tom Hanks. Veterans of the program told their stories. Engineer Ghaffar, who had commanded the first successful engagement, went on to lead anti-Taliban fighters into the Tora Bora Mountains in pursuit of Osama bin Laden in 2001. He later served as mayor of Jalalabad before being removed from office. Abdul Wahab, who had fired one of the first successful shots, became a banker in later years. He nursed a gauzy nostalgia for the joys of being young jihadists, describing those years as good, exciting times. The lessons of the Stinger program have been studied at military academies and intelligence agencies ever since. The CIA's covert operation demonstrated both the power and the perils of proxy warfare. It showed how a relatively modest investment in the right technology could achieve strategic effects out of proportion to its cost. It also revealed the dangers of blowback, of arming groups whose goals aligned temporarily with American interests, but whose ultimate aims were fundamentally different. The September 11th attacks and the subsequent American invasion of Afghanistan brought these contradictions into sharp focus. American soldiers found themselves fighting in some of the same valleys, where Mujahideen had once been trained by American advisors, sometimes against fighters who had received American weapons and money. The story of the Stinger in Afghanistan is ultimately a story about the limits of power and the unexpected ways that technology can reshape conflict. The Soviet Union entered Afghanistan confident in its military superiority. It possessed tanks, aircraft, artillery, and all the instruments of modern warfare. It faced opponents armed with rifles and determination. Yet within a decade, those opponents had prevailed, not by matching Soviet firepower, but by acquiring the single capability that could neutralize Soviet advantages. The Stinger was not a wonder weapon that guaranteed victory. Many missiles missed their targets or malfunctioned. Soviet countermeasures reduced effectiveness over time. By the final months of the war, some analysts noted that the Mujahideen had largely stopped firing them, preferring to sell the missiles or save them for future use. But the psychological and tactical impact during the critical period from September 1986 through the summer of 1987 had been decisive. The Soviet pilots, who had once ruled Afghan skies, experienced the transformation most directly. They had flown with confidence, knowing that nothing on the ground could reliably threaten them. They had watched villages burn beneath their rotors, seen Mujahideen scatter at their approach, felt the invincibility that comes with total air superiority. Then, suddenly, their fellow pilots began falling from the sky. Their tactics had to change, their altitude had to increase, their effectiveness had to diminish. The war that had been winnable, or at least sustainable, became neither. The Hinds that had terrorized the Mujahideen were themselves terrorized by an enemy they could not see until the missile was already tracking toward them. The transformation extended beyond the battlefield to the very heart of the Soviet system. The Afghan war had exposed contradictions that the Soviet leadership could not resolve. An empire built on the promise of historical inevitability was losing to opponents who should have been swept aside by the forces of progress. A military that had prepared for armored warfare in Central Europe was being bled by guerrillas in mountain valleys. A planned economy that could build nuclear weapons could not build an aircraft countermeasure effective against a shoulder-fired missile. The war contributed to the broader crisis of confidence that would culminate in the dissolution of the Soviet Union itself. On that September afternoon in 1986, Engineer Ghaffar could not have known all that would follow from his team's actions. He knew only that the helicopters were falling, that the weapon had worked, that for the first time, the Mujahideen had proven they could fight back against their most feared enemy. The Soviets dominated Afghan skies until the Stingers arrived. After September 25th, 1986, they never dominated them again. The weapon that changed everything had proven its worth. The hunters had become the hunted, and the long Soviet retreat from Afghanistan had begun in earnest. The total scope of the conflict can be measured in the statistics that accumulated over nearly a decade. Soviet forces reached a peak strength of approximately 115,000 troops. They deployed an estimated 500 to 650 helicopters, of which roughly 250 were the fearsome Mi-24 Hinds. Between December 1979 and February 1989, approximately 620,000 Soviet soldiers served in Afghanistan, though only 80,000 to 104,000 were present at any given time. The 40th Army conducted operations across a country of some 250,000 square miles of the most unforgiving terrain on Earth. The CIA's Operation Cyclone grew from an initial allocation of $695,000 in mid-1979 to 20 to 30 million annually by 1980 to 630 million by 1987. The first weapons shipped were antique British Lee Enfield rifles. By the program's end, the United States had provided some 2,300 Stinger missiles along with the most sophisticated small arms available. The Inter-Services Intelligence trained between 16,000 and 18,000 Mujahideen fighters annually by early 1986. The Saudi contribution matched American funding dollar for dollar. The human cost defies precise calculation. Official Soviet figures recorded their dead at just over 14,000. Afghan casualties numbered in the millions. Refugees exceeded 5 million at the peak of the crisis. An entire generation of Afghans knew nothing but war. The physical infrastructure of the country was devastated. Roads, bridges, irrigation systems, schools, and hospitals were destroyed. The social fabric was torn beyond easy repair. The consequences extended across decades, and it continued to shape events to this day. The transformation that began on September 25th, 1986, stands as testament to a fundamental truth about warfare. Technology can shift the balance of power in ways that no one fully anticipates. A single weapon system, in the right hands at the right time, can make previously impossible outcomes suddenly achievable. The Soviets had every conventional advantage. They lost, anyway. The Mujahideen had the determination to fight. What they lacked was the means to challenge Soviet air power. When that means arrived, in the form of a 5-foot tube with a 35-pound missile, everything changed. The experience of Soviet pilots who survived the Stinger era provides perhaps the most visceral testimony to the weapon's impact. Before September 1986, flying missions in Afghanistan was dangerous but manageable. The primary threats were mechanical failure, the thin air at high altitudes that degraded helicopter performance, and the occasional ground fire that could be suppressed or evaded. After the Stingers arrived, every mission became a calculated gamble with death. Pilots who had once flown with aggressive confidence now approached each sortie with dread. The missile gave no warning until it was already tracking. The thermal plume of a Hind's engines was an invitation to destruction. Survival meant flying at night when possible, hugging terrain so closely that rotor strikes became a constant danger, releasing ordnance from altitudes that made accuracy impossible, and hoping that countermeasures would work when they often did not. The transformation in Mujahideen psychology was equally profound. For 7 years, the fighters had endured bombardment with no means of meaningful response. They could dig into caves, disperse into the population, move only at night, but they could never strike back at the machines that hunted them. The arrival of the Stinger changed their entire conception of what was possible. Suddenly, they were not merely surviving Soviet attacks, but inflicting casualties on their tormentors. Young fighters who had grown up watching helplessly as helicopters devastated their villages now possessed the means to bring those helicopters down. The boost to morale was incalculable. Recruitment increased, cooperation between factions improved. The sense that victory might actually be achievable spread throughout the resistance. The broader international community took notice of the transformation. Other nations fighting Soviet-backed forces or facing Soviet threats studied the Afghan example closely. The lesson was clear. Shoulder-fired anti-aircraft missiles could neutralize the helicopter gunships that had become the symbol of Soviet military intervention around the world. The same technology that brought down Hinds over the Hindu Kush could theoretically bring down Hinds over Angola, Nicaragua, or any other battlefield where Soviet-supplied aircraft dominated. The psychological impact extended far beyond Afghanistan itself. The Stinger did not win the war by itself. It was one factor among many in a complex conflict shaped by ideology, geography, international politics, and the stubborn courage of Afghan fighters who refused to accept foreign occupation. But it was the factor that made the difference when the difference mattered most. It turned the tide at the moment when the tide needed turning. It demonstrated to the Soviet leadership that the war could not be won at acceptable cost. It proved to the Mujahideen that they could drive out the superpower that had invaded their homeland. It showed the world that even the mightiest military machines have vulnerabilities that determined opponents can exploit. The Soviets dominated Afghan skies from December 1979 until September 1986. They dominated them for nearly 7 years, using that dominance to punish resistance, destroy supply lines, and support ground operations across the country. Their helicopters had become instruments of terror, appearing without warning to devastate villages, hunt caravans, and insert special forces teams that would slaughter anyone they found. The Mujahideen had learned to fear the sound of rotor blades, to scatter at the sight of the distinctive Hind silhouette, to pray that today would not be the day the flying tanks came for them. Then a team of fighters on a hillside near Jalalabad Airport raised American-made missiles to their shoulders and pulled the triggers. The helicopters began to fall. The balance shifted. The withdrawal became inevitable. The war that had seemed endless finally had an end in sight. Everything changed in those few seconds on that September afternoon. And the world has never forgotten what a Stinger missile can do. The weapon that cost a few tens of thousands of dollars to produce had brought down machines worth millions, had shifted the course of a superpower's military adventure, had demonstrated that even the mightiest forces have vulnerabilities that can be exploited by those with the will and the means to exploit them.